Chapter 7. It was perhaps natural that Joan should dream that night of Miss Gilby. Miss Gilby in a solar topee, walking beside her in the desert and saying in an authoritative voice, "You should have paid more attention to lizards, Joan. Your natural history is weak." To which, of course, she had replied, "Yes, Miss Gilby." And Miss Gilby had said, "Now don't pretend you don't know what I mean, Joan. You know perfectly well. Discipline, my dear." Joan woke up, and for a moment or two thought herself back at St. Anne's. It was true the rest house was not unlike a school dormitory. The bareness, the iron beds, the rather hygienic-looking walls. "Oh dear," thought Joan, "another day to get through." What was it Miss Gilby had said in a dream? Discipline. Well, there was something in that. It had really been very foolish of her the day before to get into that queer state all about nothing. She must discipline her thoughts, arrange her mind systematically, investigate once and for all this agoraphobia idea. Certainly she felt quite all right now, here in the rest house. Perhaps it would be wiser not to go out at all. But her heart sank at the prospect. All day in the gloom, with the smell of mutton fat and paraffin and flit, all day with nothing to read, nothing to do. What did prisoners do in their cells? Well, of course, they had exercise, and they sewed mailbags, or something like that. Otherwise, she supposed, they would go mad. But there was solitary confinement. That did send people mad. Solitary confinement, day after day, week after week. Why? She felt as though she had been here for weeks. And it was how long? 2 days? 2 days. Incredible. What was that line of Omar Khayyam's? "Myself with yesterday's 10,000 years." Something like that. Why couldn't she remember anything properly? No, not again. Trying to remember and recite poetry hadn't been a success. Not at all a success. The truth is, there was something very upsetting about poetry. It had a poignancy, a way of striking through to the spirit. What was she talking about? Surely the more spiritual one's thoughts were, the better. And she had always been a rather spiritual type of person. "You always were as cold as a fish." Why should Blanche's voice come cutting through to her thoughts? A very vulgar and uncalled for remark, really, just like Blanche. Well, she supposed that that was what it must seem like to someone like Blanche, someone who allowed themselves to be torn to pieces by their passions. You couldn't really blame Blanche for being coarse. She was simply made that way. It hadn't been noticeable as a girl because she had been so lovely and so well bred, but the coarseness must always have been there underneath. Cold as a fish indeed. Nothing of the kind. It would have been a good deal better for Blanche if she had been a little more fish-like in temperament herself. She seemed to have led the most deplorable life, really quite deplorable. What had she said? One can always think of one's sins? Poor Blanche. But she had admitted that that wouldn't give Joan occupation long. She did realize then the difference between herself and Joan. She had pretended to think that Joan would soon get tired of counting her blessings. True, perhaps, that one did tend to take one's blessings for granted. What was it she had said after that? Something rather curious. Oh, yes. She had wondered what, if you had nothing to do but think about yourself for days and days, you might find out about yourself. In a way, rather an interesting idea. In fact, quite an interesting idea. Only Blanche had said that she herself wouldn't like to try it. She had sounded almost afraid. I wonder, thought Joan, if one would make any discoveries about oneself. Of course, I'm not used to thinking of myself. I've never been a self-centered sort of woman. I wonder, thought Joan, how I appear to other people. I don't mean in general, I mean in particular. She tried to remember any instances of things people had said to her. Barbara, for instance. "Oh, your servants, mother, are always perfection. You see to that." Quite a tribute, in a way, showing that her children did consider her a good manager and housewife. And it was true. She did run a house well and efficiently. And her servants liked her. At least they did what she told them. They weren't perhaps very sympathetic if she had a headache or wasn't feeling well, but then she hadn't encouraged them on those lines. And what was it that very excellent cook had said when she had given her notice? Something about not being able to go on forever without any appreciation? Something quite ridiculous. "Always being told when a thing's wrong, ma'am, and never a word of praise when it's right. Well, it takes the heart out of you," she had answered coldly. "Surely you realize, cook, that if nothing is said, it is because everything is all right and perfectly satisfactory?" "That may be, ma'am, but it is disheartening. After all, I'm a human being, and I did take a lot of trouble over that Spanish rag-out you asked for, though it was a lot of trouble, and I'm not one that cares for made-up dishes myself." "It was quite excellent, cook." "Yes, ma'am, I thought it must be, as you finished it all in the dining-room, but nothing was said." Joan said impatiently, "Don't you think you're being rather silly? After all, you are engaged to do the cooking at a very good salary." "Oh, the wages are quite satisfactory, ma'am." "And therefore the understanding is that you are a sufficiently good cook? If anything is not satisfactory, I mention it." "You do indeed, ma'am." "And apparently you resent the fact?" "It's not that, ma'am, but I think we'd best say no more about it, and I'll leave at the end of my month." Servants, thought Joan, were very unsatisfactory, so full of feelings and resentments. They all adored Rodney, of course, simply because he was a man. Nothing was ever too much trouble to do for the master, and Rodney would sometimes come out with the most unexpected knowledge concerning them. "Don't pitch into Edna," he would say surprisingly. "A young man's taken up with another girl, and it's thrown her right out of gear. That's why she's dropping things and handing the vegetables twice and forgetting everything." "How on earth do you know, Rodney?" "She told me this morning." "Very extraordinary that she should talk to you about it." "Well, I asked her what was wrong, and as a matter of fact I noticed her eyes were red as though she had been crying." Rodney, thought Joan, was an unusually kind person. She had said to him once, "I should think that with your experience as a lawyer you would get tired of human tangles." And he had answered thoughtfully, "Yes, one might think so. But it doesn't work that way. I suppose the country family solicitor sees more of the seamy side of human relationships than almost anybody else, except a doctor. But it only seems to deepen one's pity for the whole human race. So vulnerable, so prone to fear and suspicion and greed, and sometimes so unexpectedly unselfish and brave. That is, perhaps, the only compensation there is, the widening of one's sympathies." It had been on the tip of her tongue to say, "Compensation? What do you mean?" But for some reason she hadn't said it. Better not, she thought. No, better to say nothing. But she had been disturbed sometimes by the practical expression of Rodney's easily awakened sympathies. The question, for instance, of old Hoddesden's mortgage. She had learned about that not from Rodney, but from the garrulous wife of Hoddesdon's nephew, and she had come home seriously perturbed. Was it true that Rodney had advanced the money out of his private capital? Rodney had looked vexed. He had flushed and answered heatedly, "Who's been talking?" She told him, and then said, why couldn't he borrow the money in an ordinary way? Security isn't good enough from the strictly business point of view. It's difficult to raise mortgages on farmland just now. Then why on earth are you lending it? Oh, I shall be all right. Hoddesdon's a good farmer. Really. It's lack of capital and 2 bad seasons that have let him down. The fact remains that he's in a bad way and has to raise money. I really can't feel that this is good business, Rodney. And quite suddenly and unexpectedly, Rodney had lost his temper. Did she understand the first thing he had asked her about the plight that farmers all over the country were in? Did she realize the difficulties, the obstacles, the short-sighted policy of the government? He had stood there pouring out a welter of information concerning the whole agricultural position of England, passing from that to a warm, indignant description of old Hoddesdon's particular difficulties. It might happen to anyone, no matter how intelligent and hard-working he was. It might have happened to me if I'd been in his position. It's lack of capital to begin with, and bad luck following on. And anyway, if you don't mind my saying so, it isn't your business, Joan. I don't interfere with your management of the house and the children. That's your department. This is mine. She had been hurt, quite bitterly hurt. To take such a tone was most unlike Rodney. It was really the nearest they had come to having a quarrel. And all over that tiresome old Hoddesdon. Rodney was besotted about the stupid old man. On Sunday afternoons he would go out there and spend the afternoon walking round with Hoddesdon and come back full of information about the state of the crops and cattle diseases and other totally uninteresting subjects of conversation. He even used to victimize their guests with the same kind of talk. Why, Joan remembered how at a garden party she had noticed Rodney and Mrs. Sherston sitting together on one of the garden seats, with Rodney talking. So much so that she had wondered what on earth he had been talking about and had gone up to them. Because really he seemed so excited, and Leslie Sherston was listening with such apparently tense interest. And apparently all he was talking about were dairy herds and the necessity of keeping up the level of pedigree stock in this country. Hardly a subject that could be of any interest to Leslie Sherston, who had no particular knowledge or interest in such matters. Yet she had been listening with apparently deep attention, her eyes on Rodney's eager, animated face. Joan had said lightly, "Really, Rodney, you mustn't bore poor Mrs. Sherston with such dull things." For that had been where the Sherstons first came to Crayminster, and before they knew them very well. The light had died out of Rodney's face, and he had said apologetically to Leslie, "I'm sorry." And Leslie Sherston had said quickly and abruptly, in the way she always spoke, "You're wrong, Mrs. Scudamore. I found what Mrs. Scudamore was saying very interesting." And there had been a gleam in her eye which had made Joan say to herself, "Really, I believe that woman has got quite a temper." And the next thing that had happened was that Myrna Randolph had come up, just a little out of breath, and had exclaimed, "Rodney, darling, you must come and play in this set with me. We are waiting for you." And with that charming, imperious manner that only a really good-looking girl can get away with, she had stretched out both hands, pulled Rodney to his feet, and smiling up into his face, had simply swept him away to the tennis court, whether Rodney had wanted to or not. She had walked beside him, her arm familiarly slipped through his, turning her head, gazing up into his face. And Joan had thought angrily to herself, "It's all very well, but men don't like girls who throw themselves at their heads like that." And then had wondered, with a sudden, queer, cold feeling, whether perhaps men did like it after all. She had looked up to find Leslie Shurston watching her. Leslie no longer looked as though she had a temper. She looked, instead, as though she was rather sorry for her, Joan, which was impertinence if nothing else. Joan stirred restlessly in her narrow bed. How on earth had she got back to Myrna Randolph? Oh, of course, wondering what effect she herself had on other people. Myrna, she supposed, had disliked her. Well, Myrna was welcome to do so, the kind of girl who would break up anybody's married life if she got the chance. Well, no need getting hot and bothered about that now. She must get up and have breakfast. Perhaps they could poach an egg for her as a change. She was so tired of leathery omelettes. The Indian, however, seemed impervious to the suggestion of a poached egg. "Cook egg in water. You mean boil?" No, Joan said. She didn't mean boil. A boiled egg in the rest house, as she knew by experience, was always hard-boiled. She tried to explain the science of the poached egg. The Indian shook his head. "Put egg in water, egg all go away. I give Mem Sahib nice fried egg." So Joan had 2 nice fried eggs, well frizzled outside and with hard, firm, pale yolks. On the whole, she thought, she preferred the omelette. Breakfast was over all too soon. She inquired for news of the train, but there was no news. So there she was, fairly and squarely up against it. Another long day ahead of her. But today, at any rate, she would plan her time out intelligently. The trouble was that, up to now, she had just tried to pass the time. She had been a person waiting at a railway station for a train, and naturally that engendered in one a nervy, jumpy frame of mind. Supposing she were to consider this as a period of rest and, yes, discipline. Something in the nature of a retreat. That is what Roman Catholics called it. They went for retreats and came back spiritually refreshed. There is no reason, thought Joan, why I should not be spiritually refreshed too. Her life had been perhaps too slack lately, too pleasant, too easygoing. A wraith-like Miss Gilby seemed to be standing at her side and saying, in the well-remembered bassoon-like accents, "Discipline!" Only, actually, that was what she had said to Blanche Haggard. To Joan she had said, really rather unkindly, "Don't be too pleased with yourself, Joan." It was unkind, for Joan never had been in the least bit pleased with herself, not in that fatuous sort of way. "Think of others, my dear, and not too much of yourself." Well, that is what she had done, always thought of others. She hardly ever thought of herself or put herself first. She had always been unselfish, thinking of the children, of Rodney, Avril. Why did she suddenly think of Avril? Why see so clearly her elder daughter's face with its polite, slightly scornful smile? Avril, there was no doubt of it, had never appreciated her mother properly. The things she said sometimes, quite sarcastic things, was really most irritating. Not exactly rude, but, well, but what? That look of quiet amusement, those raised eyebrows, the way Avril would stroll gently out of the room. Avril was devoted to her, of course. All her children were devoted to her. Were they? Were her children devoted to her? Did they really care for her at all? Joan half rose out of a chair, then sank back. Where did these ideas come from? What made her think them? Such frightening, unpleasant ideas. Put them out of her head. Try not to think of them. Miss Gilby's voice, pizzicato. "No lazy thinking, Joan. Don't accept things at their face value because that's the easiest way and because it may save you pain." Was that why she wanted to force these ideas back? To save herself pain? Because they certainly were painful ideas. Avril. Was Avril devoted to her? Was Avril Come now, Joan, face it. Was Avril even fond of her? Well, the truth was that Avril was rather a peculiar kind of girl, cool, unemotional. No, not perhaps unemotional. Actually, Avril had been the only one of the 3 children to give them real trouble. Cool, well-behaved, quiet Avril. The shock it had given them, the shock it had given her. She had opened the letter without the least suspicion of its contents. Addressed in a scrawled, illiterate hand, she had taken it to be from one of her many charitable pensioners. She had read the words almost uncomprehendingly. This is to let you know as how your eldest daughter is carrying on with the doctor up at the sanitarium. Kissing in the woods, something shameful it is and ought to be stopped. Joan stared at the dirty sheet of paper with a definite feeling of nausea. What an abominable, what a disgusting thing. She had heard of anonymous letters. She had never received one before. Really, it made one feel quite sick. Your eldest daughter, Avril? Avril of all people in the world, carrying on, disgusting phrase, with the doctor up at the sanatorium. Dr. Cargill, that eminent, distinguished specialist who had made such a success of his tubercular treatment, a man at least 20 years older than Avril, a man with a charming invalid wife. What rubbish! What disgusting rubbish! And at that moment Avril herself had walked into the room and had asked, but with only mild curiosity, for Avril was never really curious, "Is anything the matter, mother?" Joan, the hand that held the letter shaking, had hardly been able to reply. I don't think I had better even show it to you, Avril. It's too disgusting." Her voice had trembled. Avril, raising those cool, delicate eyebrows of hers in surprise, said, "Something in a letter?" "Yes." "About me?" "You'd better not even see it, dear." But Avril, walking across the room, had quietly taken the letter out of her hand, had stood there a minute reading it, then had handed it back and had said, in a reflective, detached voice, "Yes, not very nice." "Nice? It's disgusting. Quite disgusting. People should be punished by law for telling such lies." Avril said quietly, "It's a foul letter, but it's not a lie." The room had turned a somersault and revolved round and round. Joan had gasped out, "What do you mean? What can you mean?" "You needn't make such a fuss, mother. I'm sorry this has come to you this way, but I suppose you would have been bound to know sooner or later." "You mean it's true? That you and Dr. Cargill—" "Yes." Avril had just nodded her head. "But it's wicked. It's disgraceful. A man of that age, a married man, and a young girl like you—" Avril said impatiently, "You needn't make a kind of village melodrama out of it. It's not in the least like that. It's all happened very gradually. Rupert's wife is an invalid, has been for years. We've simply come to care for each other. That's all." "That's all, indeed?" Joan had plenty to say and said it. Avril merely shrugged her shoulders and let the storm play around her. In the end, when Joan had exhausted herself, Avril remarked, "I can quite appreciate your point of view, mother. I dare say I should feel the same in your place, though I don't think I should have said some of the things you've chosen to say. But you can't alter facts. Rupert and I care for each other, and although I'm sorry, I really don't see what you can do about it." "Do about it? I shall speak to your father at once." "Poor father. Must you really worry him about it?" "I'm sure he'll know just what to do." "He really can't do anything at all, and it will simply worry him dreadfully." That had been the beginning of a really shattering time. Avril, at the heart of the storm, had remained cool and apparently unperturbed, but also completely obdurate. Joan had repeated to Rodney again and again, "I can't help feeling it's all a pose on her part. It's not as though Avril were given to really strong feelings of any kind." But Rodney had shaken his head. "You don't understand Avril. With Avril it is less her senses than her mind and heart. When she loves so deeply that I doubt if she will ever get over it." "Oh, Rodney, I really do think that is nonsense. After all, I know Avril better than you do. I'm her mother." "That doesn't mean that you really know the least thing about her. Avril has always understated things from choice. No, perhaps from necessity. Feeling a thing deeply, she belittles it purposely in words." "That sounds very far-fetched to me," Rodney said slowly. "Well, you can take it from me that it isn't. It's true." "I can't help thinking that you're exaggerating what is simply a silly schoolgirl flirtation. She's been flattered and likes to imagine—" Rodney had interrupted her. "Joan, my dear, it's no good trying to reassure yourself by saying things that you yourself don't believe. Avril's passion for Cargill is serious." "Then it's disgraceful of him. Absolutely disgraceful." "Yes, that's what the world will say, all right. But put yourself in the poor devil's place. A wife who's a permanent invalid, and all the passion and beauty of Avril's young, generous heart offered to you on a platter, all the eagerness and freshness of her mind. 20 years older than she is." I know. If he were only 10 years younger, the temptation wouldn't be so great." "He must be a horrid man, perfectly horrid." Rodney sighed. "He's not. He's a fine and a very humane man, a man with an intense, enthusiastic love for his profession, a man who has done outstanding work. Incidentally, a man who has always been unvaryingly kind and gentle to an ailing wife." "Now you are trying to make him out a kind of saint?" "Far from it. And most saints, Joan, have had their passions. They were seldom bloodless men and women. No, Cargill's human enough to fall in love and to suffer. Human enough, probably, to wreck his own life and to nullify his life work. It all depends." "Depends on what?" Rodney said slowly. "It depends on our daughter, on how strong she is and how clear-sighted." Joan said energetically, "We must get her away from here. How about sending her on a cruise to the northern capitals or the Greek islands, something like that?" Rodney smiled. "Aren't you thinking of the treatment applied to your old school friend, Blanche Haggard? It didn't work very well in her case, remember?" "Do you mean that Avril would come rushing back from some foreign port?" "I rather doubt whether Avril would even start." "Nonsense. We would insist." "Joan, dear, do try and envisage realities. You cannot apply force to an adult young woman. We can neither lock Avril in a bedroom nor force her to leave Minster. And actually, I don't want to do either. Those things are only palliatives. Avril can only be influenced by factors that she respects. And those are? Reality. Truth." "Why don't you go to him, to Rupert Cargill? Threaten him with scandal?" Again Rodney sighed. "I'm afraid, terribly afraid, Joan, of precipitating matters." "What do you mean?" "That Cargill will throw up everything and that they will go away together." "Wouldn't that be the end of his career?" "Undoubtedly. I don't suppose it would come under the heading of unprofessional conduct, but it would completely alienate public opinion in its special circumstances." "Then surely, if he realizes that—" Rodney said impatiently. "He's not quite sane at the moment. Don't you understand anything at all about love, Joan?" Which was a ridiculous question to ask. She had said bitterly, "Not that kind of love, I'm thankful to say." And then Rodney had taken her quite by surprise. He had smiled at her, had said, "Poor little Joan," very gently, had kissed her, and had gone quietly away. It was nice of him, she thought, to realize how unhappy she was over the whole miserable business. Yes, it had indeed been an anxious time. Avril silent, not speaking to anybody, sometimes not even replying when her mother spoke to her. "I did my best," thought Joan. "But what are you to do with a girl who won't even listen?" Pale, wearily polite, Avril would say, "Really, Mother, must we go on like this? Talking and talking and talking. I do make allowances for your point of view, but won't you just accept the plain truth that nothing you can say or do will make the least difference?" So it had gone on until that afternoon in September, when Avril, her face a little paler than usual, had said to them both, "I think I'd better tell you. Rupert and I don't feel we can go on like this any longer. We are going away together. I hope his wife will divorce him, but if she won't, it makes no difference." Joan had started on an energetic protest, but Rodney had stopped her. "Leave this to me, Joan, if you don't mind. Avril, I must talk to you. Come into my study." Avril had said with a very faint smile, "Quite like a headmaster, aren't you, Father?" Joan burst out, "I'm Avril's mother. I insist." "Please, Joan, I want to talk to Avril alone. Would you mind leaving us?" There had been so much quiet decision in his tone that she had half turned to leave the room. It was Avril's low, clear voice that stopped her. "Don't go away, Mother. I don't want you to go away. Anything Father says to me, I'd rather he said in front of you." Well, at least that showed, thought Joan, that being a mother had some importance. What a very odd way Avril and her father had of looking at each other, a wary, measuring, unfriendly way, like two antagonists on the stage. Then Rodney smiled slightly and said, "I see. Afraid." Avril's answer came cool and slightly surprised. "I don't know what you mean, Father." Rodney said with sudden irrelevance, "A pity you weren't a boy, Avril. There are times when you are quite uncannily like your great-uncle Henry. He had a wonderful eye for the best way to conceal the weakness in his own case or to expose the weakness of his opponent's case." Avril said quickly, "There isn't any weakness in my case." Rodney said deliberately, "I shall prove to you that there is." Joan exclaimed sharply, "Of course you are not going to do anything so wicked or foolish, Avril. Your father and I will not allow it." And at that, Avril had smiled just a little, and had looked not at her mother, but at her father, offering, as it were, her mother's remark to him. Rodney said, "Please, Joan, leave this to me." "I think," said Avril, "that Mother is perfectly entitled to say just what she thinks." "Thank you, Avril," said Joan. "I am certainly going to do so. My dear child, you must see that what you propose is quite out of the question. You are young and romantic, and you see everything in quite a false light. What you do on an impulse now will bitterly regret later. And think of the sorrow you will cause your father and me. Have you thought of that? I'm sure you don't want to cause us pain. We have always loved you so dearly." Avril listened quite patiently, but she did not reply. She had never taken her eyes from her father's face. When Joan finished, Avril was still looking at Rodney, and there was still a faint, slightly mocking smile on her lips. "Well, father," she said, "have you anything to add?" "Not to add," said Rodney, "but I have something of my own to say." Avril looked at him inquiringly. "Avril," said Rodney, "do you understand exactly what a marriage is?" Avril's eyes opened slightly. She paused and then said, "Are you telling me that it is a sacrament?" "No," said Rodney. "I may consider it as a sacrament, or I may not. What I am telling you is that marriage is a contract." "Oh," said Avril. She seemed just a little taken aback. "Marriage," said Rodney, "is a contract entered into by two people, both of adult years, in the full possession of their faculties and with the full knowledge of what they are undertaking. It is a specification of partnership, and each partner binds himself and herself specifically to honor the terms of that contract. That is, to stand by each other in certain eventualities, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse. Because those words are uttered in a church and with the approval and benediction of a priest, they are nonetheless a contract. Just as any agreement entered into between two people in good faith is a contract. Because some of the obligations undertaken are not enforceable in a court of law, they are nonetheless binding on the persons who have assumed them. I think you will agree that, equitably, that is so." There was a pause, and then Avril said, "That may have been true once, but marriage is looked upon differently nowadays, and a great many people are not married in church and do not use the words of the church service." "That may be so. But 18 years ago, Rupert Cargill did bind himself by using those words in a church, and I challenge you to say that he did not, at that time, utter those words in good faith and meaning to carry them out." Avril shrugged her shoulders. Rodney said, "Will you admit that although not legally enforceable, Rupert Cargill did enter into such a contract with a woman who is his wife? He envisaged at that time the possibilities of poverty and of sickness, and directly specified them as not affecting the permanence of the bond." Avril had gone very white. She said, "I don't know what you think you are getting by all this. I want an admission from you that marriage is, apart from all sentimental feeling and thinking, an ordinary business contract. Do you admit that, or don't you?" "I'll admit it." "And Rupert Cargill proposes to break that contract with your connivance?" "Yes." "With no regard for the due rights and privileges of the other party to the contract?" "She will be all right. It's not as though she was so terribly fond of Rupert. All she thinks of is her own health, and—" Rodney interrupted her sharply. "I don't want sentiments from you, Avril. I want an admission of fact." "I'm not sentimental." "You are. You have no knowledge at all of Mrs. Cargill's thoughts and feelings. You are imagining them to suit yourself. All I want from you is the admission that she has rights." Avril flung her head back. "Very well. She has rights." "Then you are now quite clear exactly what it is you are doing?" "Have you finished, father?" "No. I have one more thing to say. You realize, don't you, that Cargill is doing very valuable and important work, that his methods in treating tuberculosis have met with such striking success that he is a very prominent figure in the medical world, and that, unfortunately, a man's private affairs can affect his public career. That means that Cargill's work, his usefulness to humanity, will be seriously affected, if not destroyed, by what you are both proposing to do." Avril said, "Are you trying to persuade me that it's my duty to give Rupert up so that he can continue to benefit humanity?" There was a faint sneer in her voice. "No," said Rodney. "I'm thinking of the poor devil himself." There was sudden, vehement feeling in his voice. "You can take it from me, Avril, that a man who's not doing the work he wants to do, the work he was made to do, is only half a man. I tell you, as surely as I'm standing here, that if you take Rupert Cargill away from his work and make it impossible for him to go on with that work, the day will come when you will have to stand by and see the man you love unhappy, unfulfilled, old before his time, tired and disheartened, only living with half his life. And if you think your love, or any woman's love, can make up to him for that, then I tell you plainly that you're a damned sentimental fool." He stopped. He leaned back in his chair. He passed his hand through his hair. Avril said, "You say all this to me, but how do I know?" She broke off and began again. "How do I know that it's true? I can only say that it's what I believe to be true, and that it is what I know of my own knowledge. I'm speaking to you, Avril, as a man, as well as a father." "Yes," said Avril. "I see." Rodney said, and his voice was tired now and sounded muffled, "It's up to you, Avril, to examine what I have told you, and to accept or reject it. I believe you have courage and clear-sightedness." Avril went slowly towards the door. She stopped with a hand on the handle and looked back. Joan was startled by the sudden, bitter vindictiveness of her voice when she spoke. "Don't imagine," she said, "that I shall ever be grateful to you, father. I think I hate you." And she went out and closed the door behind her. Joan made a motion to go after her, but Rodney stopped her with a gesture. "Leave her alone," he said. "Leave her alone. Don't you understand? We've won.